From the moment Elon Musk stepped onto the stage of Steven's show, the energy in the room felt unusually stiff. There was no warm laughter, no casual icebreaker between host and guest. The claps from the audience faded quickly, and what followed was a growing sense that the evening wasn't going to play out like a typical late-night interview. Stephen Colbert, normally sharp but affable, was visibly on edge. He leaned forward in his chair, resting a finger against his temple, his usual charm replaced with a simmering edge. Elon, on the other hand, kept his posture rigid, his eyes narrowed, just enough to signal he had sensed the change. What was meant to be a simple discussion about future technology and artificial intelligence turned sharply political. Stephen, using his platform the way he often did, began to criticize the ethical implications of automation, data mining, and corporate influence over public discourse. But he wasn't just raising questions. He was making accusations. Subtle, at first, then barbed. He began connecting Musk's companies to broader social concerns, from job displacement to misinformation and surveillance. He accused Elon of dodging responsibility, of hiding behind innovation while chaos brewed in the real world. Elon didn't respond with silence or diplomacy. He was tired, and he wasn't in the mood to entertain what he saw as theatrical ambush tactics. His face tightened as Stephen spoke, and when he finally responded, his tone carried the sharpness of a man who had been publicly challenged one too many times. Instead of explaining or clarifying, he pushed back, hard. He fired off criticisms of the media, of shallow entertainers who capitalized on outrage, and even took a personal swipe at Stephen's credibility. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Laughter turned awkward. The rhythm of the show faltered. This wasn't clever banter anymore. It was turning into something darker, something far more personal. Stephen's eyes narrowed as Elon leaned forward. The words exchanged weren't jokes. They were warnings. Elon accused the host of using his platform to mislead the public, of twisting facts into narratives that served only to inflate his own moral superiority. Stephen retaliated with venom cloaked in sarcasm, suggesting that maybe if Elon focused less on colonizing Mars and more on the problems here on Earth, the world might actually improve. The air grew heavy. This wasn't just about differing opinions, it was ego versus ego. Neither man backed down, and the studio's tension was thick enough to silence the crew. Cameras kept rolling, but eyes behind them exchanged silent glances, wondering if this episode would even make it to air. By the midpoint of the interview, the show had fully derailed. Elon no longer cared about the scripted talking points. Stephen, now visibly irritated, discarded his cue cards altogether. The back and forth had become a full-on verbal war, each man delivering thinly veiled insults beneath the illusion of conversation. There were no laughs, no cheers, only stunned silence as the energy escalated. Then came the moment that shifted the temperature completely. Stephen made a remark that was clearly intended to humiliate, questioning Elon's mental stability and suggesting his ambition was driven more by delusion than vision. The audience gasped. Elon's face went pale, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer force of boiling restraint. He didn't lash out right away. Instead, he paused, collected himself, then spoke in a way that made the entire room hold its breath. He didn't yell. He didn't flinch. He simply delivered a statement so brutally honest and cutting that it froze Stephen in place. The host, usually the dominant voice in the room, suddenly found himself without a retort. But Stephen wasn't going to be silenced. He gritted his teeth, leaned in, and fired back even harder. And that was when the producer offstage began to inch forward, sensing the interview was veering into territory that might explode. The confrontation was far from over, but the air was shifting. This was no longer entertainment. It was personal warfare, live in front of millions. The studio lights, once warm and inviting, now cast a stark, uncomfortable glare. What had started as a tense exchange had shifted into something no one on set had ever witnessed before. Elon's gaze didn't break, as Steven tried to reassert control of the room with a dry, defensive chuckle. But the humor fell flat. No one was laughing anymore. The production crew remained motionless behind the cameras, too stunned to even glance at their monitors. Elon adjusted his posture, straightening his back and leaning slightly forward, signaling that he wasn't just offended. He was fully engaged in the fight now. Steven, sensing that his authority was being eroded in real time, decided to escalate. His voice sharpened as he went beyond jabs at Elon's character. He questioned his influence, mocking the hero worship that surrounded Musk's ventures. He labeled the tech billionaire a manipulator, someone who cloaked self-interest in the language of progress. Every word landed like a blow, and it was clear that he was no longer interested in a balanced exchange. This was retaliation, but Elon refused to take it passively. He tilted his head slightly, that familiar expression of disbelief creeping across his face, the kind that suggested not anger, but contempt. He didn't shout. He dissected. His response was cold, measured, and calculated to wound. He called out the entertainment industry's hypocrisy, tearing into the performative outrage of television. Personalities who thrived on division while claiming to stand for the truth. And in doing so, he flipped the power dynamic. Suddenly, it was Steven who looked cornered, blinking more rapidly, his smile tightening unnaturally. The audience had gone quiet long ago, watching the spectacle unfold with a mix of awe and unease. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't a staged disagreement. It was raw, unfiltered animosity. Steven's temper flared again, and he cut Elon off mid-sentence, trying to regain the upper hand. But Elon pushed through, steamrolling over the interruption, with the kind of conviction that didn't require volume. It was the voice of someone who knew his words couldn't be ignored. That was when the first real sign of panic appeared. The show's floor manager signaled frantically from the sidelines, trying to steer the segment toward a break. Steven ignored him. He was too deep in it now, too proud to back away. But Elon noticed. He looked past Steven, directly at the crew, and smirked, not out of amusement, but in acknowledgement of just how far things had gone off script. Then came the moment no one expected. Steven took a personal shot, not at Elon's politics, not at his businesses, but at his family. It was brief, but it was sharp enough to cut through any remaining civility. Elon's jaw tensed, and his shoulders squared. A few audience members shifted in their seats, sensing that a line had been crossed that could not be walked back. Elon stood up. Not abruptly, not for show. He rose slowly, deliberately, towering over the desk. The studio froze. His words were icy as he leveled a final remark that shattered whatever was left of the illusion of a conversation. His expression betrayed nothing, but the message was clear. This interview was over. Not because of a disagreement, but because of the sheer disrespect now hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Steven, caught between pride and uncertainty, tried to laugh it off, gesturing as if everything was fine. But his voice cracked slightly. The mask was slipping. Elon remained still for a second longer, then took a step back from the desk and turned toward the exit. The floor manager was already rushing to cut to commercial, but the cameras were still rolling. The audience watched in stunned silence as Elon walked off the stage, not with a tantrum, but with a calm so unnerving it felt more powerful than anything he could have said. The sound of his footsteps echoed louder than the applause ever had. Steven sat alone behind the desk, visibly rattled. The moment he tried to resume the show, his voice lacked the usual control. He attempted to regain composure, reaching for humor, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The crowd no longer looked entertained. They looked unsure of what they had just witnessed, and backstage, the producers scrambled, trying to decide whether to air the segment at all. The fallout was already beginning to form like a storm on the horizon. By the time Elon left the building, the footage was already being dissected in real time. Leaks spread like wildfire. A few backstage staff had recorded parts of the confrontation on their phones, and within an hour, grainy clips were everywhere. The internet was devouring it, not as entertainment, but as a cultural flashpoint. It wasn't just trending, it was consuming every corner of the news cycle. Commentators, bloggers, rival hosts, and influencers all rushed to weigh in, each with their version of what the clash represented. Some praised Elon for standing his ground, calling him the only person brave enough to challenge the smirking elitism of late-night television. Others accused him of arrogance and ego, claiming he had exposed his inability to take criticism without resorting to condescension. On the other hand, Stephen found himself caught in a far more volatile storm. While some of his loyal viewers applauded him for daring to call out a billionaire, a surprising number turned against him, shocked by how personal and bitter the exchange had become, especially the moment he crossed into Elon's family life. The network scrambled to manage the crisis. Executives held emergency meetings, fearing legal fallout or sponsor backlash. The show's team debated whether to edit the segment or scrap it entirely, but it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The raw footage had already eclipsed anything they could sanitize, and the public wasn't just watching, they were choosing sides. Behind the scenes, Elon remained unbothered. He refused to release a formal statement, dismissing the uproar as the predictable outcome of television desperately clinging to relevance. But privately, he wasn't done. He began quietly pulling strings. Business relationships with the network were reviewed. Advertising agreements from his companies were reevaluated. Even potential media ventures were placed into motion, signaling that this wasn't going to fade away with a few apologies. Stephen, however, was visibly shaken. The confidence that usually defined his presence now wavered. When he returned to the air the following night, he attempted to address the incident, hoping to regain narrative control. But his delivery lacked the poise that had made him a respected voice. There was no humor strong enough to cushion the fallout. Each line felt rehearsed, and the audience, though polite, no longer felt fully in his corner. What made matters worse was the reaction from within the entertainment industry. Fellow hosts distanced themselves. Longtime friends remained silent. A few even hinted that Stephen had finally gone too far, that his relentless pursuit of conflict under the guise of comedy had begun to corrode his reputation. What was once viewed as sharp wit now seemed, to many, like mean-spirited antagonism hiding behind applause signs. Meanwhile, Elon's stature only grew. He appeared at a tech conference days later, walking onto the stage with the kind of nonchalance only someone unaffected by scandal could possess. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. He spoke briefly, avoiding any direct mention of the incident, but his tone made it clear. He had no intention of apologizing, and he didn't need to. The public's reaction had vindicated him. Even within the network, whispers grew louder. Junior staff expressed frustration that Stephen's ego had turned a routine interview into a PR disaster. Senior producers argued over whether the show needed new leadership. The tension that had begun on stage now seeped into the very fabric of the organization. But Stephen wasn't ready to admit defeat. He doubled down, planning a follow-up episode where he'd address the topic once and for all. A monologue, prepared in secret, would lay out his defense and challenge Elon's version of events. He was determined to reclaim control, to remind people that he was the one who set the tone of the show, not the guests. Yet he failed to realize just how much the ground beneath him had shifted. The audience no longer saw him as untouchable. The power he once held, the ability to dictate narratives with a smirk and a punchline, had been punctured, and the man who had caused that rupture wasn't playing by the rules of television. Elon had made his point not through rage or rebuttal, but through restraint and precision. And now, with the world watching, he was preparing for the final move. Not out of vengeance, but principle. Days after the fallout, the media was still locked onto the confrontation. Talk shows speculated, online pundits dissected, and headlines refused to move on. Stephen tried to stay above water, but the damage clung to him like a stain that wouldn't lift. His audience had changed. The applause no longer came naturally. The crowd that once hung onto his every word now watched with measured skepticism. And behind his polished delivery, even his most devoted followers could sense it. He was rattled. The promised monologue aired a week later. It was calculated, meticulously written, and framed to present Stephen as the misunderstood truth-teller, the one who dared to challenge power. But the execution was brittle. He delivered his lines with an almost desperate precision, weaving moral arguments with tired humor, hoping to recapture his authority. Instead, the broadcast felt like a plea, not a performance. What was meant to be a reclaiming of control only deepened the perception that he had lost it. Then Elon made his move. It began quietly. A press release announced a new media project, an interview series hosted by Elon himself, featuring unfiltered conversations with thinkers, engineers, scientists, and public figures. The tagline was bold: no scripts, no spin. The timing was not a coincidence. The announcement landed just hours after Stephen's monologue aired, deliberately overshadowing it. Musk didn't have to mention the show. The message was implicit. He was creating a platform where substance mattered more than staged provocation. But that wasn't the real blow. At a high-profile innovation summit streamed globally, Elon took the stage to deliver a keynote. The room was packed, the energy electric. He started with what everyone expected: talks about clean energy, space exploration, and future cities. But then, midway through the speech, he paused. The lights dimmed slightly and the tone shifted. Without naming Stephen directly, he described a culture of entertainment that had lost its way, one that punished vision and rewarded mockery. He spoke of how progress had become easy to ridicule but difficult to defend. And in that moment, he didn't sound like a CEO. He sounded like a cultural architect reclaiming space from those who had abused their influence. The audience erupted, not just in applause, but in understanding. He had turned the entire controversy into a rallying point for those who felt disillusioned with empty debates and orchestrated outrage. It wasn't about personalities anymore. It was about purpose. And Elon had made himself the face of that purpose. Back in the studio, Stephen watched the footage from a quiet office. He said nothing. His team sat nearby, equally silent. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it no longer made sense to retaliate. The more he spoke, the smaller his voice became. The show would go on, but something essential had been lost. The control, the fear he used to instill in guests who crossed him. It was gone, replaced with doubt. Elon, on the other hand, continued forward without hesitation. His new media project launched within weeks, drawing massive interest. Public figures who once feared being misrepresented began lining up to appear. The platform became a space where ideas reigned, where conversations were unscripted and raw. And every time someone asked about the origin of it all, they were reminded of that night on Stephen's show. The night Elon didn't argue to win, but to walk away with his dignity intact. The confrontation that had once seemed like a career-ending moment had become something else entirely. It had revealed fault lines in a crumbling structure and introduced a new kind of engagement that valued substance over spectacle. Elon hadn't just walked off a set. He had dismantled the idea that anyone, no matter how clever or comfortable in the spotlight, was immune to accountability. In the end, it wasn't volume that settled the conflict. It wasn't sarcasm or applause. It was resolve. And Elon Musk, with nothing more than composure and timing, walked away not only undefeated, but untouchable.